This single flight left a $24 billion crater in the German economy. Yet the Philippine bank accounts suppose on June 18, 2020, the fintech giant Wirecard finally admitted that 2 billion euros never existed. This revelation exposed a decade of shell companies that fooled the entire financial world. The panic inside Wirecard's headquarters in Aschheim was palpable. For months, investigative journalists at the Financial Times had been screaming about a massive hole in the books, but then the hammer dropped. Auditor EY finally refused to sign off on the 2019 accounts, realizing that the proofs of funds they were holding were nothing more than sophisticated forgeries. The missing 1.9 billion euros represented a quarter of the company's entire balance sheet. While CEO Markus Braun stayed behind to face the fallout, his second-in-command, the enigmatic Jan Marsalek, was already miles ahead of the law. On June 23, 2020, Marsalek pulled off one last masterstroke. He booked a series of decoy flights to Manila to lead investigators on a wild goose chase. In reality, he was headed to Belarus and eventually Russia, aided by professional handlers. Behind him, he left a trail of shattered pension funds, furious investors, and a corporate giant that had been built entirely on a foundation of air. It was a $24 billion house of cards that had finally met its match, leaving the world to wonder how a modern tech titan could lie so brazenly for so long without anyone noticing the rot at the core. To understand the shadow that swallowed $2 billion, you have to go back to the gritty origins of 1999 in Aschheim, a nondescript suburb of Munich. While the rest of the world was panicking about the Y2K bug, Wirecard was quietly carving out a lucrative niche in a corner of the internet that traditional banks were too refined. This was the Wild West of the early web, a landscape of processing payments for offshore online casinos and adult entertainment portals. It was the original sin of the company, a foundation built on high-risk, high-margin transactions that established an early appetite for but the trajectory of the firm shifted forever in 2002. That was the year Markus Braun, a cold, calculating Austrian technocrat and former KPMG consultant, took the reins as CEO. Braun didn't just want to facilitate poker bets. He wanted to architect a global empire. He executed a reverse takeover by merging Wirecard with a struggling entity named Infogenie, and began a surgical rebranding that scrubbed the company's reputation in favor of a squeaky clean fintech image. Braun didn't do it alone. By his side was the charismatic and mysterious Jan Marsalek, an Austrian high school dropout who would together, they were presented as the dream team of German engineering. Braun presented himself as the German answer to Silicon Valley's elite, often seen in black turtlenecks, preaching the gospel of a cashless future where Wirecard was the invisible digital plumbing of the world. By 2005, the company had successfully listed on the tech DAX, and the momentum became a freight train. Braun, who held an enormous 7% stake in the firm, became the face of the Silicon-Tal Deutschlands, or the Silicon Valley of Germany. He wasn't just building a company, he was creating a national symbol of German modernization. This meteoric rise culminated in September 2018, a moment of supreme triumph for the Bavarian startup. Wirecard officially replaced the century-old Commerzbank in the DAX 30, the elite index of Germany's 30 most prestigious companies. At its peak, the firm was worth 24 billion euros, a valuation that made it more valuable than the venerable Deutsche Bank. It was hailed as the German PayPal, a tech disruptor that had seemingly conquered the slow-moving world of traditional finance through superior code and pure, relentless ambition. To the public and the politicians in Berlin, It was the perfect success story, a golden child of European engineering that could finally compete with the giants of California. But beneath the polished surface of the Aschheim headquarters, the vision of a digital future was being used to camouflage a financial black hole that was growing larger with every line of code they wrote. Inside the sleek glass walls of Aschheim, the technical architecture of Wirecard's success wasn't built on a revolutionary algorithm, but on a ghost network known as third-party. Jan Marsalek, the enigmatic COO who moved through the world like a phantom, was the mastermind of this shadow system. The logic was simple enough for any investor to swallow. Since Wirecard lacked its own licenses to process payments in certain high-growth Asian markets, they outsourced the work to third-party partners. Companies like Al Alam Solutions in Dubai were presented as massive processing hubs, funneling billions of. In reality, these partners were often little more than shell entities with a desk and a laptop, generating mountains of fake transaction data. This wasn't just accounting fluff. It was a wholesale fabrication of economic reality. To make the balance sheet appear legitimate, the company needed to prove that the massive profits from these TPAs actually existed in cash. This is where the phantoms of Manila come into play. Wirecard claimed that a staggering 1.9 billion euros, roughly $2.1 billion US, was held in escrow accounts at two of the Philippines' largest financial institutions, BDO Unibank and BPI. This cash represented the lifeblood of the company, providing the liquidity that justified, but the most shocking. While the world saw a fintech titan rivaling the likes of Apple Pay or PayPal, the reality was a meticulously maintained digital mirage. To deceive the auditors at EY, Wirecard presented forged documents and spurious bank confirmations that appeared to verify the existence of the nearly €2 billion hoard. These weren't amateur fakes. They were sophisticated enough to blindside one of the Big Four accounting firms for an entire decade. While legitimate engineers in Munich were working on real code, the executives were managing a ledger of fictional users and non-existent payments. This was a silicon betrayal of the highest order, where the promise of a German tech miracle was used as a smokescreen for a multi-layered financial scam. When investigators finally contacted the Philippine banks directly, the response was chilling. BDO and BPI confirmed they had no relationship with Wirecard whatsoever. The money wasn't just missing, it had never been there in the first place. The architecture of the company was designed to hide a hollow core, exploiting the very regulatory systems meant to protect the market. Wirecard wasn't just disrupting finance. It was weaponizing the aesthetic of high-tech innovation to execute a heist in plain sight. In the shadows of Wirecard's gleaming Aschheim headquarters, a different kind of war was being waged, one not fought with lines of code, but with intimidation and state-sponsored silencing. Financial Times investigative journalist Dan McCrum had been tracking the cracks in the empire since 2015. But every time he pulled a thread, the empire. This wasn't just corporate PR. It was a psychological operations campaign. McCrum found himself followed by shadowed figures on the streets of London and targeted by sophisticated hacking attempts, while Wirecard's legal teams buried the FT under a mountain of litigation. Yet, the most chilling betrayal didn't come from the company itself. It came from the heart of the German regulatory system. The Federal Financial Supervisory Authority, known as BaFin, chose to view Wirecard as a national champion under attack from Anglo-Saxon speculators rather than a massive fraud. Instead of auditing the company's suspicious balances, BaFin President Felix Hufeld turned the agency's power against the messengers. In January 2019, after McCrum exposed systemic cooking of the books in the company's Singapore office, BaFin took an unprecedented step. They banned the short selling of Wirecard stock. This effectively froze the market to protect the company's valuation, and in a shocking move, the regulator filed criminal complaints against the journalists themselves. Inside the firm, the environment was even more toxic. Pav Gill, a sharp-witted legal counsel of Indian heritage in the Singapore office, had discovered the TPA fraud and tried to alert his superiors. Instead of an internal investigation, he was met with immediate intimidation and corporate gaslighting. Realizing his own safety was at risk, Gill was forced to leave Singapore, becoming the primary whistleblower who leaked the devastating documents that eventually shattered the illusion. This political shield reached the very top of the German government, as former Chancellor Angela Merkel promoted Wirecard during a 2019 diplomatic trip to China, cementing its status as an untouchable tech icon. Jan Marsalek, the polished Austrian mastermind with a penchant for high-stakes intrigue and suspected ties to the Russian GRU, used these high-level connections and intelligence assets to ensure that the $28 billion house of cards remained standing. He weaponized the German government's pride and their desperation for a global tech winner, treating investigative curiosity as a threat to national security. Any engineer or auditor who looked too closely at the Philippine escrow accounts found themselves staring into a void of threats and legal harassment. As the line between a disruptive fintech startup and a shadow intelligence operation became non-existent. Over a decade of fraud was protected not by superior encryption, but by the very institutions designed to stop it. The dust in Aschheim never truly settled. When Wirecard filed for insolvency on June 25, 2020, it wasn't just a company dying. The aftermath has been a cold, calculated autopsy of a billion-dollar lie. In December 2022, the doors of a high-security courtroom in Munich swung open for the trial of the century. Markus Braun, the man who once sat at the right hand of power, now sits behind bulletproof glass. Dressed in his trademark dark turtleneck, he remains a stoic enigma, maintaining that he is the victim of a shadow But as the prosecution lays out the evidence of the €1.9 billion void, the image of the visionary CEO dissolves into that of a man who looked the other way while the house burned. The scale of the destruction is staggering. Over €10 billion in investor value vanished into thin air, leaving retail investors and pension funds holding nothing but digital receipts for ghost transactions. While Braun faces the gavel, the man holding the matches is nowhere to be found. Jan Marsalek's escape remains the ultimate insult to the thousands of investors who lost everything. He didn't just flee a crime scene, he vanished into the geopolitical ether. Currently believed to be living under the protection of Russian intelligence in Moscow, Marsalek has transitioned from a fintech COO to a global phantom on Interpol's most wanted list. Recent investigations suggest he may have been a valuable asset for the GRU, using Wirecard's global reach to monitor sensitive money flows. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was a security breach on a continental scale. His disappearance via a private jet to Minsk, just hours before he was to be arrested, serves as a haunting reminder of the intersection between The ripples of the collapse forced a scorched earth policy within the German government. Felix Hufeld and top leadership at BaFin were purged as the agency was revealed to be a watchdog that refused to bark, choosing instead to investigate the journalists who exposed the truth. The resulting Financial Market Integrity Strengthening Act, or FISG, was a desperate legislative attempt to stitch back together a shredded reputation, increasing the penalties for fraudulent accounting to levels never seen in post-war Germany. Even the titans of the auditing world weren't spared. EY, the gatekeepers who signed off on years of phantom profits, now face a barrage of lawsuits and a permanent stain on their legacy for a decade of failure. They failed to perform the most basic step of accounting, verifying with the Philippine banks that the cash actually existed. In the end, Wirecard is a cautionary tale that echoes the courtroom battles of Facebook or the scorched earth litigation of Waymo versus Uber. It proves that in the high-stakes world of global fintech, the most dangerous weapon isn't a line of code. It's the trust of a nation desperate for a hero. The 10 billion euros in market value that evaporated wasn't just money, it was the credibility of an entire economic system. This wasn't a standard business failure, it was a technological betrayal perpetrated by those who knew exactly how to exploit the world. In Silicon Valley and now in the tech hubs of Europe, your biggest threat is not the competition, it is the person sitting next to you. Subscribe and hit the bell for more stories of tech empires built on broken trust. Tell